The good news is with just tuning and some basic bolt-on modifications, we can get somewhere in that 450 to 500 range. And we can do so while maintaining a good bit of reliability because these engines can handle a lot more power than that. Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Automotive here. Today we're going to be talking about performance modifications and upgrades for the Infiniti Q50. The Q50 was released in 2014 and it initially got the VQ35 and VQ37 engines that were used in the Infiniti G35, G37, as well as the Nissan 350Z and 370Z. And then in 2016 it received a Mercedes engine in a handful of markets, but most importantly, in 2016, the option was added for the VR30DDTT. And yes, the last two letters on that stand for twin turbocharged, which we love to hear because that means usually that just a few basic bolt-on modifications and engine tuning can add a ton of power. And that is absolutely true for the Infiniti Q50s that have the VR30 engine on them. So today in this video, we're going to focus on the VR30 3-liter twin turbocharged engine. But if you have one of the Q50s that uses one of the VQ engines, we have previously done performance modification videos for the Infiniti G35 and the G37. And the modifications for Q50 are going to be the same as those ones. Go ahead and check out those videos if you're interested in that, because today we're going to be focusing on the twin turbocharged VR30DDTT, which can make some extremely impressive power with just some basic bolt-on modifications. So before we jump into those mods, let's go ahead and talk just briefly about the power capabilities and power limits that we face on the VR30 engine platform. So these engines are extremely strong. They can handle a ton of power in stock form without needing a bunch of excessive internal or block modifications. Generally speaking, the internals are good for 600 to 650 wheel horsepower with some reliability, and the block is good for 800 plus wheel horsepower. And this was years ago, back in like 2018, but when AMS Performance got their hands on one of these, they set an early record at 804 all-wheel horsepower with just forged rods and forged pistons. And so with just a few slight internal modifications, you can get these things to over 800 wheel horsepower, but we can handle up to the 600s, without having to get into that. Where we're primarily going to be restricted on the VR30 engine is going to be with the fueling. The factory fueling setup with the direct injection on it is really going to be your first limitation. The best thing to do from a fueling standpoint is to run 100% E85, but that requires low pressure fuel pump and high pressure fuel pump upgrades. On the Q50 with a stock turbocharger on pump gas and stock fueling, you're going to be restricted to somewhere around 450 to 475 wheel horsepower. There are a few fueling modifications that we can do that I'll talk about in a little bit that can get you closer to that 500 wheel horsepower level. But once you do have enough fueling to be able to break past that 500 mark, that's where you're going to start to reach the limitations of the stock turbocharger, which are going to go at about 525 wheel horsepower. And so ultimately, to go from 525 wheel horsepower up to 550 or 600, we're going to need turbocharger upgrades, and then we're definitely going to need full fueling upgrades to run 100% E85. The good news is with just tuning and some basic bolt-on modifications, we can get somewhere in that 450 to 500 range. And we can do so while maintaining a good bit of reliability because these engines can handle a lot more power than that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the modifications that we have. First thing, of course, is tuning. Tuning is going to be the building block of all of these other modifications. It's where your big power gains are going to come from, and it's what's going to really optimize the engine and give you those big power gains by turning the boost up and working the turbochargers a little bit harder. A lot of these other modifications on here are to help support tuning and to help improve reliability when tuned, but also you'll see good power gains from them. Tuning alone can take you up to around 400 wheel horsepower. The power gains that you see from it are really going to depend on how much you start with. Some of these Q50s started with 300 horsepower from the factory. And then you've got a few models that had 400 horsepower from the factory. If you've got a 300 horsepower model, you're getting a lot more power gains by throwing tuning on it and getting up to 400 wheel horsepower than you do on the other models, because the other models came with a more aggressive tune from the factory. But nonetheless, depending on how aggressive of a tune you're running, you can see 350 to 400 wheel horsepower just with tuning alone. Now, once you've got tuning on here, it's important to make sure we're getting air into the engine faster and getting air out of the engine faster. So second modification on my list is going to be an upgraded intake. Upgrading the intakes on the VR30 is going to help bring more air to the turbochargers, and so it's going to help them spool faster. It's going to take a little bit of stress off of them, and you're also going to see a few benefits like improved throttle response. An intake's definitely important and worth it, just to make sure we're supplying the turbochargers with the air that they need to be able to hit those higher boost levels. And you'll see good power gains out of it when tuned, but most importantly, we're trying to help feed those turbochargers so that they can do the heavy lifting and bring those extra power gains for us. And then third, of course, is going to be exhaust upgrades. Like I mentioned, once we've got all this air coming into the engine, we now need to work on getting it out of the engine. So when I say exhaust upgrades, the best thing to do on the VR30 is going to be downpipe upgrades. There are some caveats here because the VR30 and the Q50 does use 4 downpipes. You have 2 primary downpipes that are considered the upper downpipes, and then you have 2 secondary downpipes, which are considered the lower downpipes. Interestingly enough, this usually isn't the case, but on the VR30, the lower downpipes with the secondary catalytic converters actually tend to be more restrictive than the primary catalytic converters. Of course, the best thing to do is just to get rid of all of them and to, fully kind of straight pipe the exhaust system and take all the catalytic converters out of play. But if you were going to choose doing the primaries or the secondaries are where you're going to see bigger power gains. You are going to have a couple different options on routes you can go here, whether you delete the catalytic converters or keep them there. From a performance standpoint, getting rid of them is the answer to maximize performance, but of course there are a lot of other considerations for vehicles that might not necessarily be dedicated track vehicles. By going with a full downpipe upgrade and removing those catalytic converters, you can see 30-40 wheel horsepower gains, because those catalytic converters create a ton of back pressure buildup, and that back pressure works against the turbine wheel, and so ultimately it slows down turbo spool, which inhibits the amount of power that the turbochargers can make. It also puts a lot of extra stress and creates a lot of additional heat too. All right, now that we've optimized airflow and turned up the boost on the turbochargers, let's talk about cooling to make sure that we are keeping the coldest air possible going into the engine. That's going to bring us to our 4th modification on the list, which is going to be a heat exchanger upgrade. The VR30 uses an air-to-water intercooler instead of an air-to-air, and so instead of seeing intercooler upgrades, we see heat exchanger upgrades. The heat exchanger upgrade is ultimately going to serve the same purpose as an intercooler upgrade would. Ultimately, what it's going to do is improve the cooling of the charged air that's going into the engine, so that we're sending colder air into the engine, because colder air is more combustible and it creates more power than hot air does. And it also helps keep our engine temperatures down and give us a healthy engine. You're not going to see huge power gains from upgrading the heat exchanger, but 1, it's going to be a fantastic upgrade from a reliability standpoint, but 2, it's going to give you really consistent performance. What happens a lot of times when you're doing a lot of aggressive driving, especially in the summertime when it's really hot outside, is you start to experience something called heat soak, where your factory intercooler can't keep up with all of the air going through, and so ultimately you end up sending hotter air into the engine, and that is actually going to cause you to lose a lot of horsepower temporarily. Just understand that you're not really going to be getting any meaningful power gains out of it, and so that does make it tough to justify the $500, $600, $700, $800 cost that a heat exchanger upgrade is. And then that brings us to the 5th thing on our list, which is fueling upgrades. Like I mentioned when talking about power limits, fueling is really going to be the primary limitation here. If we're just running, pump gas, we're going to be limited to about 450 to 475 wheel horsepower. And to really push above that, we're going to need to start looking at additional fueling. What you can do on completely stock fueling system on a Q50 is either run a small blend of E85, so run like an E30 blend, or you can run race gas. Running like an E30 blend can actually give you, somewhere around maybe 10 extra wheel horsepower, and it doesn't cost anything because you can run that safely on the stock fueling system. Once we start talking about needing to run aggressive amounts like 100% E85, where we need significantly more fueling, then we need to start looking at upgrading the fueling system. But there of course are a couple other ways to get additional fueling without running E85 or fully upgrading the fueling system, and that's going to be through methanol injection. Methanol injection can help provide us some of that additional fueling power to get us up to maybe around the 500 wheel horsepower level. But ultimately, at some point, you're going to need to do a full fueling upgrade if you really want to get meaningfully into the 500s, at which point you're also going to be looking at turbocharger upgrades as well. 500 wheel horsepower is a pretty good kind of ceiling of where we're at without getting, significantly deep into our pockets on upgrades and modifications. So overall, just a handful of bolt-on modifications and a few $1,000s, and you can get yourself a pretty reliable 450 wheel horsepower. These engines can handle significantly more than that, and so you will have decent reliability and not have to worry about blowing your motor at those power levels. If you want to try to push things further, you got extra room to do so. It's just going to cost you the money to upgrade those turbos and upgrade that fueling system. But anyways, guys, that covers it for our video on the Q50 and the VR30DDTT engine. If you guys appreciate this content, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for all of our future videos.